your experiences in, you can almost call it diplomacy when you're like, religion is a very emotional topic, right? Or it can be.
Often is.
Wars have started over religion, or most wars have, right?
And when they haven't started as a result of a religious conflict, those who are not themselves religion have great capacity to use religion to start and to encourage and inflame conflict.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's hard to tell which is the chicken and which is the egg.
I'm Garrett Wong, and this is the Investing to Win podcast. How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you? Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Garrett. Good to be here.
I'm very happy. I've been looking forward to this interview for a very long time. We're going to be discussing a wide variety of topics, but as you know, I normally like to start with a brief introduction. So why don't you give us your background? Well, as much as you
as
want
much as
to,
I can manage.
Yeah.
I'll try and keep it reasonably tight for time's sake, and because I should say in advance that one of my great weaknesses or strengths, depending on your predilection, is I can illustrate almost everything by a story, even when that perhaps is not the most suitable way to go into an extended narration. But I'm probably a child of my generation, which is the early baby boom. I was born just after the war, but the place I was born shaped me dramatically. It was in a city which is actually an island just upstream from Montreal. There's the island of Montreal, the island of Île-Perrot, and then Salaberry de Valleyfield, named after a Scottish village from which many of the immigrants to Canada came, and General de Salaberry, who ultimately was the victor at the Battle of Allen's Corners when the Americans decided to visit us with hostile intent. And de Salaberry and a handful of Algonquin First Nations folk sent them back packing at the Battle of Allen's Corners. And it was, many say, a turning point in the war. It's even featured in the National War Museum. But it was a seaport, and I think I can't possibly underestimate the importance of that. This was a transshipment port, especially, where cargo would come in from all over the world up the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was just being developed when I was a child, and then transshipped to other parts of the continent. So the reality of that seaport and the sense that the world was somehow at my doorstep, or very close to my doorstep at least, I think has informed virtually everything I've done in my life since. And the other factor was also that it was a city of churches. I grew up in the midst of church bells. And no matter how one looks at the values or transgressions of church communities, there's nothing like church bells to be inspiring. I grew up wanting to be, quite frankly, a test pilot, but finding that at the time my eyes weren't quite going to be enough to make the cut, which is ironic because when I turned 70, I've returned to 20/20 vision, but that's another story about lost leaders. It was an expectation on the part of my parents and whole family that I would be the first of my generation, or first of my family, to attend post-secondary education. And although there was no particular stress on what I might do, it was simply expected that that would happen. There were no doubts about it. That was what I was going to do. And during the course of my early years at Bishop's University in the Eastern Townships of Quebec, I found that my second passion looked like it was going to be law, with a career in politics to follow. But in fact, one lightly snowy night, it was almost a precursor to Pierre Trudeau's famous walk in the snow in 1984. I found myself walking across the quadrangle at Bishop's 19th century Victorian facaded university to what was called Divinity House to have a talk with Father Anito, who was the head of the theological program at the time, and saying, "Father Anito, I'm having a really tough time here. I think I may have a vocation to ministry." And essentially, it went from there. I resisted that call to ministry in many ways. I started studying theology and found that it was really my happy place to be in the context of wrestling with big issues and with really intelligent, even largely wise people, well educated, but also well thought. So I felt at home studying theology, but I still wasn't sure. So I spent a number of years in academic education in the newly born CEGEP program, the Collège d'éducation générale et professionnelle, that was being born in the wake of Quebec's Quiet Revolution, and then spent a few years with the Centre Financier de la Baie, eventually the Bay Financial Center in downtown Montreal, where I helped to establish the first Bay Financial Center in the Bay store, the flagship store in Montreal. And I then went to the Investors Group, where actually my second trip to Manitoba occurred. I was the highest producing rookie in 1979 and was here in January 80, where Art Morrow presented me with my qualified planner certificate. But there was still this nagging sense that this wasn't really where I belonged, and so I renewed vocation into ministry, this time with the United Church of Canada, and really haven't looked back. I've spent 25 years continuously in the pulpit, as we say in the trade, but I also became fairly swiftly involved in church governance and administration, and found that I had, partly through the mentorship of Rabbi Harry Joshua Stern in the early 70s, a capacity and a fascination for other religious traditions and how Christianity, in its better iterations, might engage with the other traditions. So between that and an interest in looking at a world that just wasn't working well, and thus engaging in what eventually became the World Federalist Movement, I found myself engaged nationally, internationally, in everything from religion to at least UN reform politics and scribbling, which goes along with these vocations. So I've written a great deal, published quite a bit, and brings me to this afternoon and being here with you.
Wow. So many ways that we could dive into that. Maybe back up just that one last part that you were talking about where you're involved in the world. Like, are we talking politics or world issues? Like, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think over the years I've been fortunate enough, well, from between 1989 and now, to have traveled to nearly 40 countries. And the type of work has varied. I was the chair of the governing council of the World Federalists of Canada, which was born in Montreux, Switzerland in 1947, with luminaries such as oh, not to drop names, but Albert Einstein. And it was a group that saw the UN as a good idea, but not good enough. And they feared, I think perhaps justifiably, that the UN's fate might resemble far too closely the fate of the League of Nations. So the World Federalist has, in its iterations around the planet, been concerned with finding ways to reform the UN, and in a whole variety of ways, I think we've contributed to that. I suppose the splashiest would have been in 1998 when the World Federalist Movement formed the Secretariat for the uh, International Criminal Court Convention in Rome, and afterwards became the lead organization in a 2,500 plus international NGO coalition for the International Criminal Court. And then working with the government of the Netherlands, the government of Canada, and particularly Lloyd Axworthy from Winnipeg at one point, and our foreign minister in the late 90s, to establish the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is, although sometimes honored more in the breach than in the observance, still a significant UN. Um, it's a UN doctrine, really, to adopt the responsibility to protect. So I was not, although I had a fling at elected politics in the early 80s, I was involved more in the bringing people together, sometimes politicians, sometimes religious leaders, mainly religious leaders. That's been my particular métier. That continued really until I was appointed Dean of the Faculty of Theology and the inaugural Dean of the Global College at the University of Winnipeg. So the two interests have been a continuous intersection for me for life. A book that my colleague Dr. Steiner from Purdue and I published in 2021 has the working, well, the focus title of religious soft diplomacy at the United Nations, and a somewhat lengthy subtitle afterwards. So this is much of the kind of work that I've been doing, and on which, insofar as I have an academic reputation, that reputation is based.
Wow. Tell me a little bit more about. You said you like to bring religions together, even though, like you said, behind the pulpit, obviously that's one form of religion. But I find that very enlightening.
It's formal dialogue, but informal dialogue as well. Uh, in the early 20th century, in 1910 actually, an event occurred in Scotland, in Edinburgh, which was labeled the Edinburgh Missionary Conference. And it was somewhat primitive in terms of its ideas of ecumenism, and the idea of interfaith conversation didn't exist at all at that point. But it began to trigger within people a willingness to take a look at the broader impact of religion in the global community. Which, even today, while in Canada, the United States, and significant parts of Western Europe, religion is seen as insignificant, the reality still is, according to the Pew and the Gallup people, that between 82 and 85% of the world's population are understood to be self-declared religious people or spiritual people. That we tend to try and use the words religion and spirituality together now. So going back to 1910, there was a movement through the first half of the 20th century to begin to get people together, recognizing that no matter what else, first, the earth is a common home, and gradually moving away from Edinburgh with the slogan, "The World for Christ in Our Time," Christians also began to sit up and say, well, wait a minute. Clearly, a number of things we haven't considered are coming into play. The first is that God appears to like difference far more than human beings do, because the Almighty created so much of it. And the second was that there could be respect and even collaboration and a kind of unity of the spirit, whether one's individual perspectives were the same or differed from one's neighbor. So in the 19th century, we used to talk about Oriental studies, which meant dealing with cultures and religions from, generally speaking, the Eastern Hemisphere. And then we began to talk about comparative religion, the challenge being, of course, that the yardstick was Christianity. Now, I'm a I'm a Christian, both by, I suppose, inheritance, but also by predilection. I'm a dyed in the wool Reformed Protestant. But having said that, I don't presume, and I'm not sure I've ever presumed, that I have all or even many of the answers to life's complexity. But I have found in working with people of other faiths, initially and still the Jewish community in Montreal, later in Toronto, Ottawa, and in Winnipeg, that was a good grounding, a good school for me to begin learning about people of other faiths, and realizing that, first of all, they didn't have to be mine, because quite clearly God seemed to be working happily as well with them as they were with my folk, sometimes, in fact, much better. Uh, and um, and the idea of somehow the world for Christ, and within that world for Christ, this huge super church that brought all Christians together, became not only personally appalling, but it gradually waned towards the middle and later 20th century. Perhaps the real significant point was in 1984 at an Italian place, a city called Riva del Garda. There was a gathering of world religious leaders, including John Paul II himself, who sat amongst the group of religious leaders rather than insisting on a place at the podium. And this is where Hans Kung began to develop the ideas that pertain to global responsibility, and to articulate some of his most famous maxims, notably, uh, there will be no peace without peace among religions. There will be no peace among religions without dialogue amongst religions. And he then articulated that as part of his vision of a global ethic, which was adopted. And towards the end of the 20th century, it looked as though there was real progress being made on all fronts towards the role of religion in global public life, providing an open and a safe table for which people of difference could come together, a safe table, one in which that difference would not only be recognized, but respected and sometimes often appreciated. That was actually the subject of my doctoral thesis at the University of Toronto 25 years ago. And within that, we began, some of us in the Protestant tradition, to speak of whole world ecumenism. Ecumenism, technically from the Greek, meaning a household. So economics, ecumenism, all from the same root, comes from the oikumene, which could be fairly tightly translated as the household of God. And the household of God is diverse, and it's rich, and it's wonderful. But of course, progress is rarely something that comes to the human the human community easily. And by the early 21st century, people woke up with a sudden jolt. Now, 9/11 was certainly a contributing factor to that. What happened last autumn in Israel with the incursion from Gaza by Hamas was another wake up call that things are not yet going smoothly. So there's much to be done. Which, going back to our initial chat when I arrived, suggests that retirement is something that I might imagine but never actually engage in.
No, I couldn't agree more. I find, I mean, we haven't talked about ethics yet. I think that's a really good segue, but your experiences in, I mean, you can almost call it diplomacy when you're like, religion is a very emotional topic, right? Or it can be. I
Often
mean,
is.
wars have started over
Mhm.
religion, or most wars have, right?
And when they haven't started as a result of a religious conflict, those who are not themselves religion have great capacity to use religion to start
Fair.
and to encourage and inflame conflict. So
Exactly.
sometimes it's hard to tell which is the chicken and which is the egg.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, that's another whole topic. But what I'm,
But we can go into that someday when you're ready.
yeah, part two of the podcast. No, your experiences interfaith, looking at humanity, if you will. I've always said, regardless of what faith you are, it's my belief that religion still shapes our morals and our beliefs, no matter what faith you are. That's my personal belief. Um, being friendly to thy neighbor, all those different types of things, they come from somewhere, right? When we talk about ethics, which is the primary reason I brought you on today,
Mhm.
what is your opinion on your experiences in interfaith, in the other things that you've done in your over your career, and how it shaped your perspective on ethics?
Mhm. Maybe a good time for me to ramble a little, but just feel free to corral such as my
I've
thoughts
got
are
the hook just
worth
over here.
corralling. Yeah, just a few initial observations. The first, perhaps, is that ethics is not necessarily synonymous with individual morality. In fact, it often differs. Individual morality, almost by definition, is a kind of custom made thing by individuals or by individual communities and cultures. There are things that we do in North America that are incomprehensible, for example, in parts of Asia or in Africa. And the way in which we view our neighbors, our families, our responsibilities in terms of individual ethics. For example, there has been, uh, well, it still is, great consternation over the so called culture wars of the 1990s, where it appeared that the only thing that people within both the Protestant and Catholic traditions in Canada and North America in general were interested in was sex. Now, problem with that, you see, is that that varies from culture to culture, what you understand about sex. And the views of sex in, say, Japan and in North America are not quite the same thing, not even so much in Africa. But the only thing we have in common concerning sex and concerning the multi perspective on gender realities is that it's overall a good thing. Now, the scripture says that. It's basically a good thing. But during the culture wars of the 1990s, with the obsession about same-sex relationships, with the obsession over female reproduction technologies and rights, um, had everything to do with a cultural background and virtually nothing to do overall with ethics. Uh, the Bible, for example, has almost nothing to say about sex. Virtually nothing. I mean, we can pinpoint particular chapters and verses. Most of them, when taken out of context, become embarrassing or constraining. But the Bible, and certainly the Christian Midrash, which is the New Testament, a Midrash, a commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures or Tanakh, is entirely interested in economics. So, in a sense, when we talk about business or the economy or ethics, a good place to go searching is absolutely in the New Testament. And they're not always consistent views as well. So, personal morality is something that each of us have to determine for ourselves. But ethics is more the grand scheme of things.
Sure.
Ethics tends to deal with the universals. And you mentioned earlier, be kind to your neighbor or friendly and so on. Well, that's part of the great commandment in Christianity, do unto others as you yourself would be done by. And the commandment in its initial Jewish iteration, in its Muslim sequential iteration, is available, quite frankly, in virtually every world religious tradition that there is. I mean, that would be an ethic. Peace above war is ethical. The question of fair dealings, of honoring treaties and agreements, is an ethical question. Whether or not somebody chooses to smoke, unwise or not, is not an ethical decision, but when I was a kid, that was understood to be a sin and a matter of ethics. There was a great fuss in the 1960s. Gail Garnett, I think a Canadian, what would you call her, folk singer, I suppose, recorded a number called We'll Sing in the Sunshine. We'll laugh every day. We'll sing in the sunshine, then I'll be on my way. Well, the elders of the local United Church found this to be the most shocking thing in the world, because it suggested that maybe somebody was going to have sex without a lifelong commitment to marriage. And it was considered to be a moral issue if a young man in that culture grew his hair or a beard, if a young woman decided to opt for a miniskirt, the kinds designed by St. Mary of Quant, for those who don't think it was such a bad idea. All of these things were considered terrible. The business about alcohol consumption. Now, alcohol has been and will be with us always, for example, but the question as to whether or not it's immoral comes down to personal associations. The most ardent teetotaler I know was so because his father had been, well, no point not being blunt, a drunk who beat the crap out of him as a kid. And so to him, it was a moral and an ethical thing not to drink. The United Church sometimes, as my own tradition, has some rather vague lines. For example, um, gambling, and particularly lotteries and raffles, are supposed to be a sin, but that's not quite the case. When the United Church speaks out against gambling, and for a long time that was about the only thing the United Church was speaking out against at the end of the last century, in some ways, it's meant to be understood that when gambling is used as a hidden tax on those who can least sustain it, that was immoral and unethical. And I think we were right on that one. But when we decided back in 1988 that we would be among the very first Christian denominations to accept that there were multiple sexual identities and multiple sexual perspectives in relationships, that seemed to us, this is not a question of personal morality, this is ethics, and it's how we treat our neighbor, whatever our neighbor may be or whatever our neighbor may choose to espouse in terms of gender identity. So the whole question of ethics to me is not completely divorced from personal morality, but it deals with much bigger things. And Maybe to give a really concrete example of what has had the greatest impact on me in terms of sorting out my outlook on the question of ethics wasn't so much experiences, although Lord knows I've had them. A case in point was in late 1983 when the government of Canada during the Trudeau Le Premier administration was going to deport about 350 Guatemalan refugees from the province of Quebec. While, and you can imagine the constitutional joy this would have struck in the heart of so many constitutional lawyers, despite the fact that Quebec had already accepted these people as immigrations, which was part of their provincial right and obligation. But it was decided that these people were perhaps freeloaders, that Guatemala was a safe place to return to. And rather than well, every opportunity, every avenue possible was attempted. In the end, a group of lawyers, clergy, activists decided the only way to counter this was to establish or to declare sanctuary for the first time in Canadian soil. And we did. And I had a Guatemalan refugee live in a transformed church study, being cared for by the congregation, and playing basketball with the kids, and being visited continuously until in May of 1984, the Prime Minister decided we'd amused him enough and ensured that there was an order in council permitting these Guatemalans, many of whom had children who were born during their sojourn in Quebec, to stay in Canada. But when it comes down to resources, it was, I think, in the late 1990s that the late Jane Jacobs, whose name you may be familiar with, she was a self educated urban philosopher, if you like, who came from New York, where she agitated greatly on social reform within cities. In fact, her first fabulous and enormous doorstopper of a book was called The Life and Death of Great American Cities. Well, she came to Canada and she lived in Toronto in uh, the university area, just a little bit to the west of the University of Toronto. And there she produced an extraordinary book that I would recommend to any of your listeners or viewers who are concerned with the business of ethics. It was called Systems of Survival. And the first takeaway is that whatever may be the case in practice, that the very existence of business itself is actually a primary ethical reality in our society. Business equals ethics. And she says this because she is trying to illustrate the two systems that she believes are um, both required, symbiotic for a successful society. The first she calls the entrepreneurial system, and that includes business and entrepreneurs and diplomats in some cases. The second she refers to as the guardian system, courts, police, um, religious leaders. And she said the two are often in conflict but needn't be. But to focus strictly on the entrepreneurial system, so the entrepreneurial system is based on broad ethical concepts of trust and of honor and agreement and of treaty. So she goes back to I think it was 1956, when Rosa Parks, down in the deep south of the United States, refused to go to the back of the bus and was consequently tried and ultimately exonerated because she had a bus ticket. And Jane's point is that a bus ticket is a contract. Contracts are the essence of an entrepreneurial business system or a business system. Without a contract, nothing really can be established. And a contract was in itself the strongest symbol of the reality of ethics, not simply as a kind of obscure idea or obtuse idea, but rather as the life and blood of any society. Now, taking that into account, there's also the foolishness that came from particularly the United States and first embodied in the Horatio Alger myth, where one pulls oneself up by one's own bootstraps. And that was turned into a quasi form of religion by Ayn Rand and her disciples in the 1940s and the 1950s. But that's inane because context is critical in almost everything. No one really pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps. They live in a society. They live within diverse groups. They have to appeal to those groups, even if they're going to stay in business. And if they don't, they won't be in business for very long. And the problem when some people who pursue business, which is a perfectly legitimate way to spend one's life, seem to feel that they owe nothing to their employees, nothing to their communities, nothing to the larger world. Well, that's where business goes wrong. And she says the the entrepreneurial system really allows for freedom, but it allows for respect for the other, even if that respect doesn't extend further than the ink on a line where signatures are applied. It demands ethical behavior. And there are some people I've known and encountered in business who seem to sometimes forget that responsibility. And that's the purpose of the guardianship system, where the courts, where legislators, where sometimes in their most successful moments, clergy can intervene. It provides a balance to the entrepreneurial system. Now, if that balance gets out of whack on the side of the guardianship um, the guardianship system, then you've got serious problems. You have things like laws being degraded and denied, and there are tendencies to apply draconian principles, often of individual morality rather than ethics, on an entire society. So, as I say, if there's one book, particularly those of your listeners who are interested in business and business ethics want to consult, it's Jane's. It's just a very, very powerful piece of work.
I think we're transitioning here into, I find it very fascinating. I agree. Morals, ethics, contracts. I love that you articulated it that way. But how do we, as a world, a society, as a business world, define ethics? Are you suggesting that it comes from the guardianship, from the courts, from the ink on a contract, and then stems from there? Or
Well, I think that I have yet to discover a source for ethical principles that doesn't lie within one of the world's great religions or spiritualities. Hence the posters that you could obtain with the golden rule, of all the various religions. If you'd like some of those, by the way, I've got a friend who actually is the one who produces them. But having generated those for different reasons, we might go back far enough to say that the first understanding of ethics were intended to propitiate the gods, so that the powers that govern the universe aren't going to be irritated with us overly. Um, but we're looking at the broad scope of civilization, and by the late Middle Ages, the feudal system where everything was top down, and really business as we know it today didn't exist. There was trading for sure, but even then, that trading had to be honorable, and if it wasn't, usually somebody ended up dead. So to begin to codify those was critical. Religion having gifted us, I think, and I think this is a fair observation, religion having gifted us with the idea, the principles of ethics as well as individual morality, which is to me a secondary question, needed to step back. And in a sense, business provides the practical application of the religious understanding of ethics.
okay,
Um, and diplomacy in much the same way. The trouble with treaties is that people tend to ignore them when it's inconvenient. And there's much being said since October 7th last year about we need a peace ceasefire. We need an unconditional ceasefire right now, no matter. But there seems to be a forgetfulness that that's precisely what there was at about 6 a.m. on the 7th of October. There was a ceasefire, and it was breached because it was no longer convenient. I'm not sure how much I ought to say politically here, but let's just say it wasn't convenient to one of the parties, and I'll leave you to imagine which party I'm
sure.
referring to. Whereas business contracts tend not to lead to that. It's an old maxim that democracies It used to be that democracies never go to war with one another, and that's an exaggeration, but they rarely go to war with one another because they trade with one another. And other than arms dealers and builders who might be putting civilization back together after yet another one of our egregious diversions from a civilized path or process, nobody benefits from a war. Nobody in any way, shape, or form benefits from it. So democracies tend to learn that because they're not necessarily, and I'm not referring to the recent case in a Manhattan courtroom, but generally speaking, democracies know that they can only thrive if there is a well ordered society based in the rule of law. And frankly, I don't think the planetary community can survive if we don't have a society based in the rule of law and based in ethics that take into consideration contexts of environmental degradation, contexts of the massive migration of peoples, partly in result of climate change and partly as a result of ongoing violence worldwide. These are all factors that have to be of concern both to the guardian system, as Jacobs called it, or to the entrepreneurial system. And the guardianship is charged with reminding the entrepreneurial system of that. And the entrepreneurial system is really required to belly up to the bar and make it happen.
In your work with the World Federalist Movement, global policy that you've seen, can you outline some, let's just say, summarize some key ethical challenges that you've seen? Maybe even categorize. I don't expect you to have to go into each one, but I mean, a general sense of commonalities of ethical challenges that you've seen in your work.
Well, there are certainly some big ones. Where to begin? Well, the very structure of the United Nations is problematic because, of course, we have two classifications of world citizens: the permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, and everybody else. Now, that automatically is a problem ethically because it simply means that the interests of those with the most power are going to prevail over those without the less power. And it reduces the General Assembly to what Winston Churchill referred to as a polyglot mob at UN Plaza, which is unfair, but unfortunately not as unfair as one wishes that it might be. So we have the two tiers there. We still have tribalism, which leads to siloism, if you like. And that's a major problem. We are dealing with insecurities. One of the reasons that I've never actually been or seen myself as principally a peace activist or among the contingents that simply want to say, peace now, we're just going to disarm, is that nobody's going to disarm if they feel they're going to be a threat in consequence of disarming. So the World Federalist Movement has concerned itself with structures for peace rather than peace directly. So we've developed and worked with, as I mentioned, the International Criminal Court responsibility to protect. One of the recent and successful projects was the one for $7 billion, which now I guess would be one for $8 billion, to ensure an open process for the selection of the General Secretary at each successive term expires, and not to allow it to simply be in the hands of two or three very powerful nations. You have global rivalries, assuming that resources are inexhaustible. And of course, they aren't. There is the question of coming together around still the very tendentious issue of nuclear power, let alone nuclear weapons. There may be great hope in it. There certainly was in the 1950s, but we know that there is great peril as well. So each of these elements are elements of planetary concern and of ethics in the full human sense. We all know in our religious traditions, for example, that we're supposed to share. We know that we are supposed to eschew racism. Well, fact is, we don't. We know that we are supposed to take care of the homeless, and yet we have now, I think, in the mid range of the 100 to 200 million people who are homeless. The I think at the onset of the 90s, the number of those who were stateless persons was roughly the population of Germany. And now you're talking double that, or we're talking double that. Um, that's as unethical and as immoral as a number of housed, or rather unhoused or underhoused, here on the streets of Winnipeg. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges, Garrett, is that we tend not to realize just how interconnected we are. It was like a rabbi, a very, very well known and celebrated Rabbi Irwin Shield, who died just recently, well past his 100th anniversary. And one day in a small conversation, we were working together on a project of Christian Jewish dialogue in Toronto. And Irwin said, thing is, we're joined at the hip, you and me, whether we like it or not. And it's that whether we like it or not, which is a big ethical question. We may not like the demands that are implicitly or explicitly posed upon us that are ethical, but there they are. We're joined at the hip. They belong to all of us. This is, as so many have quaintly termed, this is our one wee boat floating through the universe. And we either all, well, I think Isaac Asimov, the very much admired science fiction writer, once said, to say that the Japanese, in this case, to say that the Japanese have a problem with their whale harvest is like saying there's a hole in their end of the rowboat. Everything that we do is about the whole of the human community. I'm not a particular I'm not particularly conversant with the butterfly effect, but if a butterfly beats its wings in Tokyo, will we actually feel it in Toronto? Well, maybe not that particular butterfly. I'm not that clever, but we are. We're all connected. There's only one tribe on this planet, and it's us. There's only one species, and it's us. And the errant, wicked nonsense that is racism is continuing to wear us down for no good purpose. I mean, can you imagine you got a couple of modifications in the human genome, and somebody has dark hair instead of light hair, somebody has dark skin instead of light skin, somebody has blue eyes instead of brown eyes. And in this past century, there are people of great stature who still manage to drink the Kool-Aid and actually believe there are different races. Even Tommy Douglas. There was a book called Our Own Master Race, and Tommy Douglas and Nellie McClung, fabulous people. I admire Tommy as our greatest Canadian in almost any way I could think to describe him, except he was a eugenicist. He was an absolute blatant eugenicist who is credited with having said at one point during the Nazi regime, the Germans are beating us at our own game. Well, good God. It's untenable. So those are a few that have come up, still come up.
You mentioned a few minutes ago obligation. And I believe as a business leader of my company or even in my industry that we do have an obligation for business success for staff in your various roles. I mean, let's talk about ethical leadership, because maybe it starts at the top. I mean, certainly you can look towards a lot of conflicts. There's a leader who's unethical and they are taking matters into their own hands for their own purposes.
Again, we're not actually thinking of anybody particular who's recently been convicted of 34 counts of.
No, we're not going to talk about.
Of course not. We wouldn't do that.
No, we wouldn't do that on
Back
the podcast.
over to you, Garrett.
Cut to commercial. No, just ethical leadership. Let's talk about that.
Well, you see it all the time. Not always effective ethical leadership, but it's absolutely there. To say anything positive about Trudeau Père in Western Canada has always been a risky thing. But the reality is that Trudeau really did try, given the pulls and tugs from every quadrant of his life, to deal with ethical leadership. As an example, when we take a look at Angela Merkel, who has been a leading light in establishing an effective G8 concerned with the entire planet, we're seeing ethical leadership. when we consider, um, oh gosh, um, when we consider Desmond Tutu and really the inseparable partnership between Bishop Tutu and Nelson Mandela, we're talking ethical leadership. Um, there is a huge amounts of it. Some of it comes from religious leaders, the Dalai Lama, for example. Certainly, both John Paul II and Francis have been noted for their ethical leadership. Although my favorite is always John the 23rd, who insisted that ethical leadership involved opening the doors and opening the windows and letting the winds of the Almighty blow through the house as though it were the first Pentecost 2,000 years ago. And yes, those people do set the tone because it's it's not in the end, no matter how strong my sense of my personal morality is, no matter how strong my commitment to ethical leadership, ethics in business, ethics in politics, even ethics in religion, in the end, the person at the top sets the tone. Again, to refer to another book, there has been, certainly during the early years of my education, there was a tendency to dismiss the ideas of the great man or great woman thesis. And there's some reason for doing that. Instead, people in many fields or disciplines wanted to identify great social trends and great waves. But the reality is, those two are inseparable, they're complementary. Margaret Macmillan, the Canadian academic, scholar, and prolific and profound writer, produced a book a decade or so ago, maybe, called People in History. And she tries to demonstrate that, yes, there are huge sea changes in societies, both local and national and even international. But for anything to happen in those sea changes, then there has to be the leadership that sees where it's going and tries to get ahead of the curve. People like Martin Luther King, with his famous statement that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's things like that that give you the hope that maybe ethical leadership is positive. Now, there are people, of course, who condemn Dr. King because, to the minds of some, his personal morality left something to be desired. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But when it comes to ethical vision, King was fabulous, and his gifts were enormous to the entire human race, never mind the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, you've taught courses on ethics, religion, society. What are your views on how ethics are going to evolve in our business world?
Oh, wow. Now, there is a there's what was that game show in years gone by, generations gone by, the $64,000 question? I'm tempted to just say beats me, but that really wouldn't serve your purposes as the host of a podcast. So
Business podcast.
yeah, let's see if we can push that a little further. I think what I'm beginning to see, and I hope we'll continue to see more of, is that key leaders in business are beginning to recognize that, in fact, ethics is efficacious. It's in the best interest of businesses. And I'm going to give you one very specific example because I think this year is its 10th anniversary. There's a chap by the name of Brian Grimm out of California. And Brian established 10 years ago this year the the Religious Freedom and Business Initiative. And it's worth looking him up. Just look up Brian Grimm and Religious Freedom and Business Initiative. What Brian has spent the last 10 years doing and gaining really tremendous response throughout the corporate world, not only smaller local businesses. This was something, for example, that touched on Abdul El Tassi here in Winnipeg. The significant contributor to Muslim and general community life, and a businessman himself. He was nominated by myself and another colleague for the annual award that Brian's organization established. I think he came 13th out of 12 winners, but he got honorable mention. So we're talking about relatively small enterprises, and then we're talking about Coca-Cola and other of the real biggies. And each week, Brian is showing how the ethics that can be that are articulated by religious and faith communities, not just the Christian, but right across the spectrum, are having an impact on businesses in terms of hiring practices, in terms of recognizing diversity. And in a global market, if a business leader doesn't recognize diversity, which is essentially an ethical principle, then that business leader might as well pack up, take early retirement, and go trout fishing in Arizona or wherever people go trout fishing, because there's no future for it. So without recognizing the diversity, which the best of religions have always promoted, the sanctity of each individual life, without recognizing that those are not simply ethical ideas, they're simply solid, good business practice, then business is going to be in trouble. But I see more and more happening where business leaders are increasingly recognizing that round tables are better than traditional board tables, because anyone sitting at a round table, and we can credit the genius to that forgotten bard who first began to recount the stories of Arthur in the 5th century of the first millennium. When you're sitting at a table that's round, the reality is that every person in every point of the circumference of that table is seeing each other in a different way. They're required to see each other. It's a beautiful Nigerian custom. One of the fascinating and truly moving and one of the greatest honors in my life is to have been 12 years ago named a high chief by the Nigerian community in Manitoba, the Umuno Igbo Association. And whenever they gather at events, at least the many events I've been to, as greetings are being offered by the leadership, one of the senior elders will look around the room recognizing people, and the way in which that person is then addressed is Azania. I see you. I see you. Business leaders try to do that through the somewhat flawed tools of focus groups uh, and polls and customer surveys and so on. But if all board tables were turned to round tables, you could actually see the person. And if you work to make your transactions in the business world transparent, that's an ethical issue. But it's also good business. Because if what you are dealing in is not transparent because you don't want it to be transparent, then what are you doing it in the first place for? You know? So all of these things are, in a sense, they I would say they emerged at that point where the religious hierarchy and the business hierarchy came together in some measure to displace feudalism in Western Europe and privilege in North America, such as it was developed. Um, but I'm seeing it on every continent with contacts in business. Now, am I sanguine? Yeah. I probably think of myself as an optimist by nature, but a pessimist by policy. And I think Murphy was an optimist. You remember Murphy's Law? If anything can go wrong, it will. Well, I've got a corollary to Murphy's Law, and that is Murphy was an optimist. So, but you don't give up hope. I mean, Garrett, whether it's in business and religious life and interfaith engagement, in personal life, if a person gives up and makes the conscious decision, sometimes so battered down that it may not even seem to be a decision, to give up hope, to cease being optimistic, well, really, it's time to find a hole, crawl into it, and pull the hole in after yourself.
You mentioned Brian's Brian Grimm's sort of perspectives.
Yeah.
What is Jim Christie's most? What's your opinion on the most pressing ethical issues facing a business today? Even a top 3 or top 5 would do.
Misogyny, racism, ignoring climactic change for the sake of short-term profits, profiting during times of conflict. And a failure to recognize that a business really only exists because of its context.
That's a really good one.
And that to me is critical. You know, there was a great deal of fuss and furor in the 1960s when Joseph Fletcher proposed the concept of situational ethics. Now, all he really did was codify how we all operate. Every ethical choice ultimately is situational, it depends on the context. Who are the players, and how do you decide sometimes what the right thing is, when very often the right thing proves to be the least wrong? So there is a sense in which this sense of context is critical to recognizing the challenges that business communities face as a part of the human species. I mean, the reality is business people, as much as religious people, are on the same boat too. You know, this we're all in this game together, whether we like it or not. So, winning is a good thing. It's better than losing, for example, in general. Losing may indeed teach one moral fiber, but it's no fun. And whether you're playing the game or trying to succeed in business, you don't play to lose. There's something about that is so irrational. I can't even imagine those who celebrate the idea of not doing their best. But I think for the business community and for all of us, the winning or the losing, neither of which are critical. What's critical is how you play the game. Now that sounds like 19th century rugby advice from the English private schools.
But let me ask you, not how, why play the game? Because that's something I've been very passionate about. Why do we build businesses?
Why do we build businesses? Why do we build churches? Why do we promote philosophies? Why do we develop courses to teach students who apparently know so little history that they're camping out on their campuses against all the things that they think Israel's doing when, quite frankly, they need to be looking more seriously at their sense of history? In a sense, why do anything? You know, Edmund Hillary was asked back in the early 50s why he, although you notice they don't mention Tenzing Norgay, who who was the Tibetan who went up with him. Why did you climb Everest? And Hillary's answer was, well, because it's there. And in a sense, none of us really know why we're here. We know simply that we are here. And the how we got here is a book that's increasingly open to the worlds of science and more or less to philosophy. So we're here. So what are we going to do with that time? I mean, never underestimate the power of fun in business or even in religion. If someone had asked me 50 years ago, 52 years ago when I was starting out, what the factors would be in my finding this a rewarding and exciting half century of my adult life, I wouldn't have said, well, it's just the sheer fun of it. Within 5 years, I know, man, this is just the sheer fun of it. I mean, this is a blast. This is a gas. Studying theology, I don't know if in the end it's going to be ultimate truth or not, but man, I'm having so much fun. And in the meantime, you see the tangible results when one gets it right. You know, when people who were at odds come together, when you can set a table that brings people who are diametrically opposed to one another in every respect can say, well, yeah, maybe I could give here, and the other person says, well, maybe I could give there a little bit, and you bring those people together, not in a perfect solution, they don't exist, but into something we can live with and then build on. So why do it? Whether your métier is business or philosophy or the academy or medicine or motor mechanics or, well, pick any walk of life. Why do we do it? Because we're here. And we may not know why we're here, but in doing whatever we seek or feel called to do with our lives, we're on the road to finding out. And if we're real lucky, maybe there's a moment in this life or whatever, if anything, waits beyond, where we will have our eureka moment that says, wow, Wow. So that was what it was all about.
Well, the reason I say why rather than how, Jim, is something that I'm self-discovering about myself and my businesses. Gone through some hard times grinding it out as some businesses do. And one of my mentors has recently said, businesses don't move people, people move the business.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll go further to say, and this again is more self-discovery, an entrepreneur usually gets into business because of something they don't want to do. They don't want to, well, they don't want to work
Sure.
full time.
Mm-hmm.
They want to have freedom, so they don't want somebody telling them what to do. Then they become an entrepreneur, and now they're doing all these things that are hard. Okay. What I'm recently learning with people move the business, not businesses moving the people, we'll see if you agree with this, is I believe that the true success of a business, and ethics go right along with that, is to build it for the people who work there.
Mm-hmm.
To align those goals with the goal of the business, and that can be ethical, moral, financial, personal, professional, financial goals. And if you can get that right, what I'm saying is a business leader shouldn't be building a business for themselves. That's the why. That's what I meant by that.
Well, that's not a bad analogy, even for those of us who have spent our lives in the guardian system, or at least most of our lives in the guardian system. A leader in, well, let's just take a Protestant community because that's where I'm located personally. Um, you're really doing everything you do for the sake of the community in which you've been set.
Higher purpose.
Very much, very very much. It's it's what's beyond you. You know, one of the ways that one might measure success, and keeping exactly that in mind, is if you're fortunate, and if in, say, one's first decade of adult life, you're able to establish those goals that are quite clearly beyond your own capacities even of your community, beyond the parameters of time or wealth, or pick and choose your talents, and then try not to lose sight of them. So, for example, I'm still not entirely sure where they came to me, but I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life when I was in my mid 20s. Now, I haven't always hewed to those particular, furrows, if that's a correct image. Certainly not necessarily conformed always to those paths. But in 1990, and I made this conscious decision of what I felt drawn to do, called to do, if you like. In 1984 was confirmed by Hans Kung, who I mentioned earlier with his narrative on global responsibility. Kung wrote an essay in one of these inspirational books where people write about things that they have learned and what they hold important and dear in life. And this was a book published in 1990 entitled Credo. And Kung, the late Hans Kung, used to write in Latin when he was feeling really good. I mean, go figure. That was his favorite language to write in. And he wrote an essay which was entitled Spero contra spem, which in the Latin means I hope against hope. And in it, he said three things. He said, Spero unitatem ecclesiarum, spero pacem religionem, spero communitatem nationem. I hope for unity amongst the churches, not organic unity, but at least respect and a sense of common collaboration. I hope for peace among religions, and I hope for community among the nations. And he spent his life working on that. And those are essentially the three things that, not knowing Kung would write this in 1990, I jotted down in 1974. And that's how I spent my life. What I've come to do in the last couple of years, and I'm sure is because of my advancing years, but still feeling as though I'm, as an old friend used to say, that the wine still flows. Um, I keep a paper journal. Um, it's, I suppose, analogous to my love for books as opposed to e readers and various other things. And as I am looking each week, so it's a week at a glance kind of archaic thing that I still love, that I've used really all my adult life. When I look at the a week at the glance, I look at each engagement, each piece of writing I'm working on, each encounter, each project that I'm enthused with, and I review each week at the end of it and say, so what did I do? How did I contribute to what my goals were and still are? And I highlight those things in yellow. And it's a rare week that I can't find at least three things that have contributed to what I've been trying to do for the last half century and more. And it is a great reliever for those moments of discouragement and even despair when you look at the world and say, oh, God, why bother? You know? To say, yeah, you're making a bit of a difference. Not much, perhaps, but of a difference. Like that hallmark moment of the little girl with the starfish on the beach, you know? She walks along, and whenever she comes across a starfish, she throws it back in the ocean. And a grown up, suitably wiser, of course, comes along and says, why are you doing that, little girl? It won't make a difference, you know? And she says to the grown up, makes a difference to this one, and throws another starfish into the ocean, into the surf.
No, what an amazing perspective. I mean, that might be something I might take from you. And just because, when people get stressed, that's a really good exercise to look at the big picture.
Yeah.
We've been chatting about, in a very broad sense, I think we've kind of come along this path now and finally transitioning into business ethics. What is your advice, or how do you see that? How critical is it for a business to incorporate ethics? I mean, that sounds like maybe a stupid question, an obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyways.
Well, like so many before me, I'm not sure there are stupid questions. Uh, there are sometimes stupid answers, but that's not the same thing, of course.
Well, let's talk about the
So,
long-term success and viability of a business.
uh,
How critical is sticking to a set of ethics, a defined set of ethics, if you can, for long-term viability?
I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, to understand what the objective of the business is, and including why one has chosen or been drawn in to that business, to understand that and then to direct one's efforts, and as you say, the efforts of those who may be employed in that business endeavor, to achieving that means employing what is an ethical tendency, and that's towards tenacity and perseverance. You keep going, and there are going to be lousy moments. There are going to be lots of lousy moments. Even when I was in business for a few years, there were a lot of lousy moments. But there are a lot of good moments. And one of the things that I found is that if a person is prepared to persevere in their particular business métier, there's support for them there. I mean, sooner or later, it may be that someone has just managed to grasp onto an idea whose time has not yet come, or a time whose time may never come. Well, that happens too. But generally, to turn it back, think of the businesses you trust, whether it's the automobile dealers, the legal firms of several generations, the church or temple or shul or synagogue you attend, which have to function as though they were businesses, even though that's not their raison d'etre. Those ones are the ones that have stayed there longer. I was in for some years the business of life insurance and investments back in the late 1970s. And nobody wants to talk to a rookie. They want to talk to somebody who's got some years under their belt, who understands how to listen to people and put their needs first. The investors group, and I don't know how they function these days, but when I was part of the investors group, the first thing you did wasn't talk about a person's income or their capacity to achieve tax breaks or exemptions or shelters. It was, so what's important to you in life? You know, that's ethical. It's taking a look at the person across the table from you and seeing them and saying, okay, what is it that moves you? What is it that drives you? And responding to that. And that only comes after people have been in whatever their business for a long time is. I could name, but probably shouldn't because that would be abusing commercial principles in a podcast like this. But I can tell you which firms in this country, in this city, never mind this country, I would always deal with, never with hesitancy, and whose metaphorical or physical hand I would shake and would know that the agreement was enough. And I can tell you, name some whose doors I would never cross again.
And that is based on ethics.
It's based on ethics.
Well, sorry for interrupting you, Jim. I would then say that there's a parallel between ethics and perception and trust.
Absolutely. The people will say that politics is essentially perception, and it is. Which politicians do you trust? Well, set aside promises, because promises they're just silly. They're to try and get people's vote for you. But anybody who knows anything about the political system, and frankly even the business systems, know that promises are really tenuous things. They're dodgy. If you deal in promises, the problem is you have to be able to fulfill them. And even looking at a couple of recent by-elections and one coming up, lots of promises being made, but a newbie, a neophyte member of the Legislative Assembly or member of Parliament or City Council can make all the promises in the world, but until they actually get in there and see what the reality is on the ground, they're pretty much hot air. What it is that I think business emphasizes when it's at its best is personal integrity, is legitimacy. And that's true as well of the religious enterprise. What's legitimate? Well, a number of traditions have come under fire for some pretty seriously bad behavior within the Christian world, but not within the Christian world alone by any means. My co-religionists and I have espoused some pretty rotten dogma in the past, and some of that pretty rotten dogma is still there. But even within those systems that appear to be corrupt, you can often find one person who you can rely on. They'll go to bat for you. They'll go to bat to make sure your warranty is honored. They'll go to bat and make sure that your integrity is preserved. They'll go to bat to ensure that there is transparency in your dealings with them. They're going to go to bat to ensure that contracts are honored without looking for the weasel clause. These are all ethical principles.
So I'm going to use a couple key words of what we're building our business around, and good businesses do, right? We're not talking about mission statement and vision statements, and those are things we want to do. We're talking about core values in religion, but also in business. And I mean, two of our core values is transparency and accountability. Well, I guess what you're saying also and agreeing with me is those are ethical principles.
Absolutely. They're ethical principles that, again, help to differentiate between personal morality. And I don't dismiss personal morality for obvious reasons. And personal morality and ethics are certainly interconnected. They intersect any number of times in any given day. But those are core values that transcend the personal moralities. Transparency and reliability. These are all ethical principles. Mark Twain was always fairly funny about it. He says, "Always tell the truth. Then you don't have to remember anything." And it's a similar kind of thing from the religious perspective. You deal as openly as you possibly can. Now there are phrases that come out. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing, except that pertains to charity, to giving quietly and consistently. It's not referring to political, economic, or religious dealings by any means. It's just to say, of all the things you do, if people really want to name a wing of an art gallery after you, okay, that's nice. Don't knock it. But that's not the motivation that needs to be there.
I asked you a few minutes ago about long-term success, viability, sustainability of a business. Mm-hmm. So, as we're starting to wrap up the podcast, if you're a business leader or you own a business and you're listening to this podcast, you need to define a set of core values. We've already established that because that defines your ethics. It defines how you operate. It's your identity.
And which is actually much more important, as just suggested, than either the vision or mission statement.
150%. Because think of the two groups that you need to inspire trust. The obvious one, the customer, the end user.
And then your employees.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Right? How many times do you know somebody, and I know we all know people who will leave a business because the leader is doing something shady / unethical, right? They just don't feel comfortable working for somebody like that, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Now, what happens? Like attracts like, right? I just talked about how you need to build a business for the people. You align those goals. Well, if you're not practicing ethics and you attract the wrong type of people, your business isn't going to function very well.
Nope. Absolutely not.
So I think you need to be transparent. You need to wear those ethics on your sleeve and hope and pray that you're going to attract the right type of top performers into your organization, because otherwise your business will not last.
And sometimes you'll screw up. But then, like a problem in mathematics in grade 3, you have to go back till you find the location of the problem, the point in the sum that doesn't add up. And you have to sometimes go a long way back to find out where that break occurred and then to rebuild the calculation. So that happens too. But that only happens if you know where you're going. And again, if the leadership is reliable and is prepared to do that where necessary. And of course, paying attention to the changing times as well.
Right, of course.
Some types of business are going to become obsolete because of new emerging technologies, for example, is the most obvious one. So be ready to retool. And that's simply part of, again, paying attention to the context. You know, if one is going to continue to promote a business that nobody wants, then enjoy it if you can afford the sheer luxury of doing that. But when I moved to Winnipeg in 2005, now so 19 years ago, I had a terrible experience with a moving company that shall be unnamed. They managed to do on a small load, which may have been worth $12,000, nearly $10,000 worth of damage. And it was tough getting compensation for that. So it's a company that I'd never deal with again, not only because they offered poor service, but because it took them so long to rectify it. So that's part of the transparency thing. Yeah? I had a mentor who was very famous for saying in the face of criticism, well, I guess I screwed up. Do you forgive me? Well, what are you going to do? You say, shoot.
Shucks. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the accountability portion and transparency. I mean, they're all the same words. So I'll give you the second last word here, because I'm going to give you the last word as well, but my audience knows what I'm going to be asking. What advice would you give to business leaders looking to foster an ethical culture within their organization?
I learned principles of leadership, including ethical leadership, when I was 14 years old. I was a Boy Scout. Much maligned as they often are, I understand, and there are problems with that, as with so many movements as we move into a different era. But I was a patrol leader in my particular scout troop, and patrol leaders were expected to take something that was labeled the Golden Arrow course. And it was manifest by a green badge, a rectangle, with a gold arrow embossed on the badge. I have never learned anything substantially new since the Green Arrow course when I was 14. Everything else has been commentary. Now, there are those unfortunate individuals who find themselves growing up for any number of reasons without the kind of ethical guidelines that were inherently there in one's parents and grandparents. They may not have been articulated that way, but fair dealing, even courtesies that seem so often to be going by the wayside now. Yeah, but that comes that really is learned before we go to school. So my first suggestion to any business leader is remember your roots. Remember where you came from. Chances are everything you need to know, to quote Robert Fulham, you learned in kindergarten, or maybe a little later than kindergarten. Pay attention to those things. Trust your instincts. Trust your gut. And for the most part, if you feel that something's wrong, there's a better than even chance it is wrong.
I love that. Okay, final question. This is the Investing to Win podcast.
Mm-hmm.
How do you define success, and what does winning look like for you?
That's actually a tough question. I don't often frame my life in terms of winning or losing, and that's largely because of the vocation I've pursued and being within the guardian system. Um, I confess I don't like losing. I don't play anything to lose. But in terms of signs of success, my grandfather, maternal grandfather, had a saying he was fond of. It's a hard thing to use as a yardstick for success, but he was fond of saying, live so that when you come to die, even the undertaker will be sorry. And if I were talking about personal success, it would be something like that. If I can pick up the phone and call someone, perhaps whom I haven't seen in a decade or 2 decades or more, and say, so listen, Mike, listen, Garrett, I've got this thing going on. Got a few minutes to listen? And if you or Mike or any number of other people in various walks of life say, well, of course, to me, that's success. It really is. If I can go to sleep at night having read, like you, a chapter out of a mystery novel and wake up in the morning and feel that it's worth getting up, I mean, these are all amorphous things. I know they're again relying on a script from a Hallmark movie, but I honestly think that's true. That's true. It is that way. And if in life you've been gifted with enough health and at least enough resources to spend them on things first that you believe are important, and then secondly, and it's not always differentiated, things you think are fun. I mean, what more can you want from success? I mean, it's not, for example, a question of money. It's a question of the lack of it. I mean, none of us really need a whole hell of a lot. But what we do need is to look at the sky and still see the blue between the clouds.
Yes.
If you can do that, you know, I mean, here we go back again to things you learned as a kid. Do you remember? Do you remember Kipling's "If"? It's actually the full title is "Brother Square Toes," and there's a line in it that says, "If you can make a heap of all your winnings and risk them on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again at your beginnings, and never speak a word about your loss. When you can do that, you've won."
Wonderful place to stop. No, amazing. I agree with everything you just said about winning. I don't base it on money. And what you're talking about, they're reaching out to somebody after 20 years and they're going to give you their ear. It's just making a difference, being a good human being. And yeah, I mean, you lay yourself down on the pillow every night and you're very happy and proud of who you are. That's winning.
Well, one more quote. I'm great for quotes. Um, Dr. Johnson, the great uh, uh, compiler of Johnson's dictionary in the 18th century, and his biographer Boswell, the life of Dr. Johnson, made the old grouch. Really, I mean, he was, as far as I can tell, Johnson was always a curmudgeon, but he had some great throwaway lines. And one of my favorite was actually stolen, I believe, from Aristotle, when Johnson said, "People don't need so much to be taught as they need to be reminded." So maybe every business, maybe every church needs to have a designated elder. I pick whatever name you like. And that designated elder's sole job is to remind the CEO, remind the board, remind the minister or priest or rabbi or imam, just to remind them of who they are and what they're. My God, I'm doing it. Of who they are and what they're there for. Maybe that's one of the key things. we'll all learn things. Can't help but learn things, because if you don't, you end up, falling off a cliff at some point in your life. But to be reminded of our better natures, of what we learned in childhood for the first place. I mean, we know the right things to do. It's wired into the fabric of our being. It's there, looped into our DNA. We know.
Just do them.
Yeah.
All right.
Like the
Thank
Nike
you.
people said, just do it.
Thanks so much, Jim, for coming with me here and spending the afternoon. It's been great. Love the philosophical discussions. We'll have to
Continue.
well, I mean, for the confines of a podcast, of course, we have to stay a little bit on track. But I love where it could have gone, and would like to delve into that in the future.
I would love that. And as they say, you know where you can find me.